Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I hope that you're keeping well. Thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Why are so many people getting sick and dying in Montreal as a result of COVID-19? There's a very interesting article recently from Bonnie Campbell in the conversation.com that pointed out that until now, there's about 630 people uh, who have died of COVID-19 in Quebec. And it's the people at the age, she claims, of 70 years older who represent 90% of the victims. And this is a worrying situation. A horrific expose in the Montreal Gazette indicated that a local nursing home, known by its French initials CHSLD, had concealed the deaths of 31 seniors. Many of them seem to have died after most staff abandoned the facility, and some of the seniors found alive hadn't had water, food, or a diaper change in years. And similar to what is happening in New York, in all the major cities, it's happening in Europe as it is. It is black people, migrants who are and immigrants who are the most affected by the mortality. And Montreal is a city that, people talk about as North America's Europe, although I'm not sure that's a fitting description, having lived there. It's a much nicer place than most of Europe. But it is the center of Canada's COVID-19. Of the entire country, 70,000 cases and 5,000 deaths. The city of 2 million people has 20,000 cases and more than 2,000 deaths, or about 64% of the entire province's death toll. So why are so many people getting sick and dying in Montreal? I'm very pleased. My guest this morning is Mustafa Hanaway, who is a long-time community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal, which organizes precarious migrant workers for their status, workplace dignity, regardless of their status, from undocumented workers to temporary foreign workers, and those living with precarious status fighting for workplace and migrant justice. He's also been very active in the solidarity movement of Palestinian self-determination with Tadamon, which in Arabic is, of course, the word for solidarity, which organized to build active support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign to end Israeli apartheid. He's doing a fascinating PhD at the moment at Concordia University, focusing on the economic geography of, guess who, Amazon.com Incorporated. And he's also a writer on immigrant labor and precarious work. A real pleasure to have you on the show, and so good to see you again, Mustafa. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Firoz, and it's so good to see you. And thank you very much for having me on this really important broadcast and also resource for activists and organizers and the general public globally, especially from the global south. So thank you so much, Firoz.
Oh, pleasure has been mine. So, Mustafa, the $64,000 question. Why are so many people getting sick and dying in Montreal?
Well, I think the reason there's a series of I think underlying reasons. Unfortunately, what you get in the mainstream discourse or in the mainstream press is that the particular spread of COVID began much earlier in Quebec than it did in other places in the rest of Canada. And granted, to a degree, because of the intersections, because of the constant travel between New York and Montreal, or between France and Montreal, that there was, let's say, greater exposure than there was in other places in the rest of Canada. But I think also, without being sort of uh, didactic or about it, but it's really grounded in the political economy, or in the structures within Quebec, and sort of its politics. And I think a lot of it gets hidden um, by the government and by the mainstream press. So even
Can you explain? I mean, most people don't know the political economy of Quebec. So help us understand that.
so, I mean, in regards to, many people always look to Quebec as being sort of, when you talk about it, the Europe of European city within North America, much more, let's say, social democratic, higher unionization rates, higher, you know, state services in terms of taking a larger portion out of the market. But under that and within that, there's a very precarious, um, uh, you know, workforce that is sort of the backbone of Quebec's economy, and especially within the healthcare system. And much of that is highly racialized, and much of that even has to do with the way of migration patterns over the last 2 years, that many of the what Francois Legault calls guardian angels. These are mostly Haitian refugee claimants, but not solely, um, who've come over from Trump, who are refugees from the United States, who crossed over after Trump had announced the ending of the TPS, or temporary protection programs for Haitian refugees in the United States. Many of those thousands came over into Quebec since 2017, and many had ended up working as what we call préposés, or um, in fact, they are uh, they're aides, they're personal assistants that work in these long-term care facilities in Montreal, and within the hospitals. And much of these jobs previous to the crisis were very much low paid, nearly minimum wage. Many of these jobs were through these temporary placement agencies. So, one aspect of the spread of COVID, so the government always says you have these two worlds. There's this world where there's a humanitarian crisis within these long term care facilities that we saw, what you talked about, Fast Head On, which saw over 31 dead within 3 weeks. We now just discovered there's another home in Laval where there's over 51 people who have died, and nearly 90% of the residents are actually infected with COVID. So, um, and many of these workers, they don't work for one, these préposés, these nurses aides, they don't work for one home
Hmm.
because they're temporary jobs. They get shuffled between different homes, and they never know where they're going to work the next day. So these workers were massive transmission belts of the virus uh, in the beginning across these different long-term care facilities. So that's one aspect of why are so many people getting sick. But then clearly there's a racialized aspect to it, and I'll get into it details. But this sort of this structure where you kind of, and we're beginning to see it take place everywhere. And you mentioned in your introduction. So in Sweden, there's actually very little conversations about it. It's a similar thing. The very first deaths in Sweden were mostly Somali immigrant migrants who were working in essential jobs, Uber drivers, working in grocery stores and restaurants. These were the very first deaths. Um, in the United Kingdom, we have the same kind of statistics coming out that that overwhelmingly, unfortunately, overrepresented in the numbers of deaths in the UK are Black, Muslim, visible minorities. Uh, in the United States, it's mostly 30% of the deaths in Michigan are Black. In New York, we have similar statistics. In Toronto, we, heard about a case where 10 Punjabi taxi drivers had lost their lives to COVID. So there's not simply, when many politicians talk about it as being the great equalizer, right? That this pandemic affects everyone equally. Well, that's actually not the case, um, because many people who have the luxury and privilege uh, to work at home or to work from home um, are able to do so. They're able to protect themselves and protect their families. And for many people uh, who are doing the essential work, both within healthcare, because of the pressures in terms of privatization within these long-term care facilities, the lowering of wages uh, within food processing industries, within these large, Amazon-like warehouses doing e-commerce. If we look at who's delivering our food right now in terms of Uber Eats or Skip the Dishes or Foodora, much of this work is being done by racialized communities who are low wage and precarious. And so, and that what as a result, unfortunately, and for obvious reasons, these are the workplaces and these are the people in the communities who are becoming directly, increasingly impacted um, by the pandemic and who are becoming the ones who are being sick. So in Montreal, for example, uh, the two neighborhoods that now are overrepresented in terms of the data are a neighborhood called Park Extension, which is a working class immigrant neighborhood that has um, the largest rate of working poverty. 30% of the entire neighborhood is consistent of full time workers who work and are paid below the poverty line or live below the poverty line. Montreal North, which is also another racialized immigrant and black, from Haiti, West Africa neighborhood, is also overrepresented in terms of the statistics of COVID as being one of the neighborhood with the largest outbreak per capita. Is one of the poorest neighborhoods of all of Canada, and deeply racialized. Uh, and so we're beginning to see those connections between uh, the way that the crisis is impacting particular people and who it's not impacting. And then at the same time, uh, we're told that it's the great equalizer. And unfortunately, Canada is not maintaining those types of statistics like we're seeing in the United States. Um, so it's very hard. So much of it is being based off of what we're finding out from particular neighborhoods in terms of their infection rate and the racialization of those neighborhoods.
So if I understand what you're saying is that most of these um, low-paid migrant workers, immigrants, are in high-risk jobs. They're high-exposure jobs and precarious at the same time. So there's an underlying stress about what's going to happen tomorrow, how we're going to pay the bill, and so on. Presumably, that's the characteristic.
Yeah. So because many of these people don't have the kind of job security, many of them are not unionized, and many of them uh, to give one clear example from my own experience just yesterday, um, we were flyering workers in Park Extension who were getting on and off of buses to work in a meat processing plant in north of Montreal. Uh, Many of these workers are being paid below the minimum wage. They don't have any job security in the sense that they're day laborers. And we discovered why there was not so many people getting on the buses, and we found out from one of our contacts that there had been an outbreak in the night shift, and there had been 24 workers and 4 supervisors who had contracted COVID. And part of the problem is that these companies are just exasperating, and sort of the overt, not just racism, but the sort of impunity that these employers and these companies have is only exasperated during this pandemic. So in the sense that uh, we know at this one factory or this one meat processing plant, before, workers weren't provided with health and safety equipment. We know that workers had lost their hands, um, by these meat cutting machines, and the employer didn't provide any relief to these workers. It was these workers, mostly South Asian, um, who organized a funding drive amongst themselves to support the families of workers who had lost their hands, or even to the extent one worker who lost their life. Uh, and this was prior to the crisis. So, what's the expectations that a company like this was going to actually protect its workforce? If you don't see them as human beings fundamentally, and you've done everything to squeeze them uh, for the very last penny out of their bodies, uh, this vision that they're completely disposable only becomes exasperated. So, did the company shut down after there was such an outbreak? No, it keeps going. Um, Another example that relates to Montreal North is Dollarama. It's a company that we talk about extensively at the Immigrant Worker Center because we work with a large pool of these workers. So it is very much an Amazon-like of the North. So this Dollarama is a multi-million-dollar corporation. In fact, the owners, the Rossi family, um, are now above the 50th richest family in Canada. They're part of Canada's ruling class. The corporation employs 20,000 workers. Um, and prior to the pandemic, in its distribution centers and warehouses and its logistics operations, uh, none of the 1,000 workers actually were employed through Dollarama. They were all employed through a series of temporary placement agencies. They weren't provided health and safety equipment. Um, all of this to hem any attempt at unionization. They were all paid below $15 an hour, which has been a demand of the Immigrant Worker Center and many organizations and social movements. And uh, when the pandemic hit, many of these workers actually became much more frightened about their health and safety. We had gone out, we went to go flyer to these workers, and for the first time, workers actually had approached us, and we asked them to make complaints to the Labor Standards Commission here in Quebec to enforce basic health and safety. Because in these large warehouses, we're talking about 1,000 people in one structure where there's no physical distancing possible because they're all moving past each other, throwing boxes to each other. No masks were provided despite the dusty uh, and bad ventilation in the workplace. There's only one bathroom for the 1,000 workers. Um, they have a locker room that is extremely tiny. So it was of course, I mean, this was going to be a source of an outbreak. There could not be any other possible outcome statistically. Um, and because the job is so bad, the turnover is incredibly high. So we're talking about 20 new workers every single day being replaced. And so as a result of this, um, uh, we know that several workers have tested positive, also supervisors have tested positive, and many of these workers live in neighborhoods like Montreal North. So, like the preposés, like the people working in the long-term care facilities, we're talking about minimum wage jobs. We're talking about insecure jobs where they don't know if they have their job the next day. These are all racialized workers. Uh, these are extremely hard jobs, and also in agriculture as well. And then you get the and even within a workplace like Dollarama. So one worker told us that everyone who was white, everyone who was Quebecois, ran away from this workplace. They stayed home, but we were forced to stay in there. Uh, so the kind of clarity that's coming out of this moment is very much clear, is that who's disposable actually and who's not, and in the most literal sense. And unfortunately, we saw this with two workers who live in Montreal North, not from Dollarama, but one working in a paint in a plastics company at the night shift, and he was 39. He was a refugee claimant from Haiti. He walked over the border in 2017, and uh, he passed away in front of his wife. Um, and that was needless. We saw another worker as well who was working as a préposé on the weekends and in a textile company Monday to Friday, and he also passed away. Uh, and so we're beginning to see the impacts uh, more and more about who's becoming affected, and who wants, and unfortunately, I mean, the thing that's sad is that what a lot of people want, they want the right to what, you know when we begin to see those racialized differences, who gets to stay home and is baking sourdough bread and who doesn't. These workers want that right, right? These workers want that right to be able to stay home, but because they're afraid that they don't have work the next day, and because they have unfortunately, a state body that's supposed to protect workers that hasn't actually ruled in favor of workers yet, refusing the right to unsafe work, that leaves a lot of workers in insecure positions.
So I mean, are you saying that whether intended or not, there is a de facto eugenics operating here, that those that capital sees as disposable may be disposed of in this situation?
Unfortunately, on the ground, it's uh, absolutely the case, and in the sense that it goes so far, it's so poignant, especially um, the kind of the political climate where our Legault at the beginning of the crisis was sort of seen as this, like many of these strongman politicians. Um, he was a great, he's been a great father figure. He's been very serious and stern, and that he was, he had one of the highest ratings in terms of provincial leaders in Canada in the polls. And last week, Quebec Solidaire tabled a motion um, that Legault in his daily thank yous thank refugee claimants who are guardian angels who are working in these long-term care homes, to thank them. And his party, the CAQ, Coalition Avenir pour Québec, um, refused. They rejected it. And then, as movements have demanded granting amnesty, um, supporting the demands of giving status to to many refugee claimants and undocumented workers, um, the Quebec government again has refused, despite the role and the central role that they're playing. But then the catch side in terms of the eugenics here is that um, we need more temporary foreign workers. We need more disposable workers. We don't want permanent residents. We don't want people with equal status and equal rights. What we need is more disposable workers. So we saw this when employers' federations were clamoring uh, in terms of will we have access to the temporary foreign worker program, or we have access to workers from Guatemala and Mexico and Honduras uh, to begin growing strawberries, to work in chicken processing plants. So there's always this need for disposable labor, and the recognition that even Francois Legault himself is that, look, I know you don't want to pick strawberries, and he was talking very clearly to his base and to a very white middle class audience. You don't want to pick strawberries. It's very hard. It's very difficult. It is long work and it's underpaid. Uh, but we will pay you extra. But that money isn't allotted for temporary foreign workers who do the exact same work. Um, so unfortunately, we are beginning to see this cruel and calculated eugenics, and the measures. We see this in deconfinement. We see this completely in the U.S., in Britain, in Sweden, and in here. Uh, is that what our activities or the activities for uh, middle class homeowners will be prioritized, right? And in terms of what they demand in terms of deconfinement, um, and in terms of the pace of deconfinement, or for big capital, right? This is the unfortunate other extent, and those who will end up being the most exposed, um, there will be very little that will be done and is actually being done to protect them, as opposed to saying more work should be deemed non-essential and should be scaled back. We're seeing sort of the opposite take place, and further exposure.
So to what extent is the coronavirus helping to lift the veil from our eyes to understand the nature of our societies? I mean, I've not been in Canada very long, but even before I came, there was this air that, well, this is a multiracial society and looks after everyone, and nobody is discriminated against, whether age or sex or sexual orientation and so on. But is this, to what extent is it revealing the nature of the society, and whose eyes are being opened?
Well, I think for many people who, for racialized communities themselves, uh, it has been, I think, the great unveiling. I think for many people who had a sense of visceral understanding, now very much have a clear political understanding. And I think because they see what's happening around them, uh, and sharing those stories. So, I was, with the group of Haitian workers at the Dollarama warehouse, and they were sharing sort of reports and videos about race and COVID in the United States that were being done in French. Um, we had, for the first time, two workers speak up in public. And we have workers trying to form a committee because at this moment, I think the one aspect that's happening is they realize that uh, employers and the Canadian state or society as a whole um, does not actually have their interest at heart as human beings, as the right to stay alive, the right to not fundamentally get sick, and sort of these ideas that might have been hegemonic before within these communities in terms of we're a liberal country, there's equal opportunity, this is a multicultural society, have been, I think, have been torn apart, or have been lifted because people are beginning to see, well, actually, that's not the case. And And so they're talking about the way racism is taking place within their workplaces, within their communities. Um, was working with a group of Egyptian and Algerian workers in a plastics company who was who are fighting um, to not go into their actual workplace. Uh, and this was a company that, when you're working with chemicals, you should be given a gas mask, not a surgical mask. And they weren't given any of these tools or life-saving equipment before, and then not even now. And then yet so that they see that they're the ones taking their risks, their lives, and there's sort of an intolerance to continue down that path. And I think the ideas of a real crisis beginning to take place, maybe not, let's say, at the material level, but at the ideological level, I think is beginning to come to fruition. And I think that, for me and what I've seen is that for the first time, workers actually beginning to speak up, whether they be undocumented, whether they be simply racialized and their permanent residents or citizens, is that you're beginning to see the ground shift. Unfortunately, and I think what needs to be thought about through more, and we're seeing that especially with Montreal Nord Republique and what's happening there in Hoodstock and Montreal North, and the kinds of grassroots organizations that are beginning to form in response to this to protect their communities, is that and like the Immigrant Workers Center or Solidarity Across Borders, is that you have organizations that have been in place to be able to sort of uh, consolidate or to be a vehicle for for these communities that are beginning to see the nature of society and that are willing to fight back. But the problem is that how do we actually build real structures at this time that could increase not only mounting pressure for their demands, but to give voice, but also to further sort of show the cracks and expose the true nature of um, racialized capitalism within Canada, within Quebec, and how do we begin to actually push things forward and give these communities and people a stronger vehicle to pursue that. So I think in some ways there is a fundamental shift within these communities.
Right. So, but I mean, that's encouraging to note. But to what extent are white Quebecois? Uh, how much of the veil is lifting from their eyes? Um, or is it merely confined to racialized communities, as you put it?
I mean, I think there probably is increasing sympathy in one way to put it with the deconfinement measures and sort of, I think, what goes going back to the way he does politics is that his popularity levels are beginning to decline rapidly, right? He's still very popular, but it's not that this demagogic sort of 80, 90% that his approval ratings have come back down to earth. And I think part of that um, is as a result of his true political nature coming out. And so I think there is increasing sympathy also amongst even the media. In Le Devoir or La Presse, you have certain journalists who are really beginning to push the matter of let's say, citizenship or status, or who are beginning to have discussions about why is it Montreal North or why is it Park Extension or Saint Michel that are these hotbeds. And so I think they're being more exposed uh, as a result of the pandemic to the realities of immigrant and migrant labor. The fact that you can't have a conversation anymore about, and we could as activists or as organizers, about where people's foods come from and who actually grows it and who does the labor. Uh, that's now becoming exposed as a reality, and I think people are beginning to see the conditions that these communities face. So I think there is a shift in terms of sympathy, but I think, and I think which is important to sort of also to go forward thinking about uh, how do we begin to capitalize on that as well. At the same time, you have this, I think, this shift within racialized communities at the same time.
So, to what extent? I mean, what has been the reaction of the trade union movement? It has traditionally ignored the casualized labor, the underpaid migrant workers, and so on. Is that shifting? What's their position, and how is that evolving?
It's slow, and I think the unions. I think much of the institutional left, and maybe people will comment or clarify. I think have been. I mean, this is part of the problem as well. And there's one aspect. There was an article about the role of trade unions, and I'm diverging for a second, but I'll get back to is the role of trade unions in South Korea in diminishing transmission within South Korea, and the role that unions played in terms of pressuring employers, pressuring the state for better conditions, even for migrant laborers in South Korea, as being a way to stop the transmission was actually effective in doing that. Unfortunately, here, I think what we're beginning to see is that a lot of unions um, are in sort of internal crises, that they are as a result of COVID, they're shedding members, um, and also I think there's debate in terms of how to go forward because of the various sort of interests within particular or larger trade unions. And so in terms of a complete shutdown of the economy, to extended health and safety, but in terms of how they've reacted to the demands of low wage or immigrant migrant labor, there has been to a degree a shift. The Migrant Rights Network, which represents 40 organizations, not just in Quebec, but across Canada, have been pushing for things like access to the emergency relief benefits for all workers, regardless of their status, healthcare to all undocumented migrants and immigrants, uh, and for regularization. And we've had the Canadian Labour Congress support the call for Labor Day. But unfortunately, outside of the public health sector unions, the voices of unions has been a little bit on the muted side, and not actually taking sort of a traditional leadership role. But you have particular unions, let's say within CSN and the nurses union, uh, that were active in organizing many Haitian préposés before the crisis, and to win them permanent jobs and better conditions, has been active in supporting the community, but there's been little of a in terms of a real strong uh, uh, voice. They've been largely in the background, and I think another aspect too is not just around these migrant issues, but over deconfinement or a shutdown of the economy completely, and challenging the reasons why Quebec is rushing to open up the economy. So I think there's a bit of a confusion that's taking place in the unions.
So why are they so reluctant? What's the material base for that?
One, many of these unions don't represent. So when you have two ends of the spectrum, right? So the unions that are mostly, let's say, politically active if on more progressive fronts, if we're talking about CSN, if we're talking about um, public sector unions like in education or in healthcare, uh, that fundamentally isn't their base. These low wage, racialized immigrant and migrant workers, and unfortunately, the unions that have organized these workplaces or these workers are mainly these very large um, sort of business oriented trade unions, right? So um, in terms of the way they operate, in terms of their internal structures. So, if we're talking about United Food and Commercial Workers, we're talking about locals of 20,000 people, no strike clauses, um, trying to downplay workers' self activity. But unfortunately, a lot of their memberships are the ones in essential workplaces, particularly in Cargill, where we've seen massive outbreaks. The largest outbreak to date in Canada was Cargill in Alberta, and then we had another similar outbreak in Chambly in south of Montreal. And so there's sort of a lack of politicization and acceptance or reluctance to challenge employers and government. The same can be said for Service Employees International Union. Obviously, there's contradictions and internal dynamics, but these are the larger unions that actually have these workers as their real base. Um, aren't very politicized, democratic institutions and organizations that can uh, propel these sort of issues into the larger public. And then what you have, the more politicized unions are the ones representing uh, uh, mainly public sector of workers who are in a different position, who are teleworking, who or some who might even have reactionary views as their base that are still being challenged, right? So there's, I think these dynamics are unfortunately a problem, and I think that's why it's um, the kind of the organizing and um, sort of the institutions that are bringing this forward. We're seeing it that's at the grassroots level, and not at this large institutional level in Quebec.
You just go back to you were mentioning about the way in which amongst the racialized communities there's a growing sense of organizing, committees being formed, and so on. Um, what can be done to magnify that voice, to make that voice heard greater, to popularize that? Because I think too often pandemics create the construct of a victim, not
Hmm.
those of fighters.
Well, I think it's really good that you highlighted that, Firoz, because I think we're living in a moment where we do have uh, fighters among us now, and um, we do have organizers, and we do have people in those communities building those institutions. So I think the way that we can think about propelling and magnifying those voices, uh, especially the challenge now, how do we think about how do we build resistance in this moment, accepting that there are physical limitations, uh, I think is begin to think about carefully constructing, maybe forms of solidarity, uh, to highlight, in a way that how come we haven't seen evening uh, balcony demonstrations for regularization or in solidarity with our guardian angels, and I think that's an interesting language that's beginning to formulate, especially for these racialized workers and communities, and that we've seen, in Spain or in British Columbia or in other places take place. Um, how do we begin to think about more online tools that can give workers a direct voice I think is fundamental. And how do we begin to get organizations and broader organizations within the left to rally around these community groups and demands, right? And to begin to crack open the institutional left to say that this is important, because I think uh, we could see those flashpoints uh, take place, that we saw in the U.S. So you're seeing hundreds of strikes by these racialized workers. Um, uh, in terms of we saw it with garbage workers. We saw it in Amazon. Um, we've seen it with food processing plants. Um, we've seen some incredible stuff in France or in Italy at the beginning of the pandemic. People want the right to live, and the right to live actually means um, challenging uh, challenging racism, challenging uh, capital, and maybe the concrete demands at the moment, whether it be for regularization that allows workers in these communities to be able to better to protect themselves, to challenge unjust conditions, to be able to live with dignity, to be able to access healthcare, whether it be ending sort of uh, profiling, or whether it be access to these communities. And one of the things that are unfortunately in Quebec uh, that we're beginning to see in sort of this sort of patronizing, when you talk about victims, and one of the most patronizing things that we see in the language and discourse, especially around the idea of reopening school or the economy, is that um, it's not about herd immunity. It's not about eugenics. It's about collective mental health. It's about the poorer segments of our society. It's about those communities. It's about Montreal North. It's about dealing with poverty and dealing with um, uh, uh, structural issues of inequality. And that's why we want to open up schools, and that's why we want to, so that way kids can get a meal, and outside of their abusive conditions or horrible housing. Uh, it, well, if that's really your concern, give people decent housing. If your concern is is that these families don't have access to food, give them food, or allow them to access these benefits and entitlements. Um, if they don't have access to the tools for basic education, uh, when people think about uh, uh, inequality in terms of the internet, or lack of access to the internet, uh, unfortunately, the racism and the discourse of the put forward by these large foundations, particularly Bill Gates, that we have to give access to poor Africa to the internet and to computers, and um, that many communities here don't actually have access uh, to those same devices. When you have teachers having to fundraise for donations to give children access to computers, one of the demands in Montreal North is access to the internet. Because if you are on aide sociale, and that's $600 to $700 a month, and you have to pay your rent, your food, and when the internet costs you $100, and maybe a cell phone with internet will also cost you another equal amount. Of course, families don't have access to these tools. Even if you are part of the working poor, you don't have access to these tools. And so many people rely on public spaces for them. So give them access to these tools. Um, and our government can clearly afford to do so, or these large corporations that are nearly a monopoly can afford to do so, but they choose to reap in large amounts of profit. Uh, so this idea that this patronizing attitude uh, to these communities and to these people, um, that we're opening up society for them. Uh, it's it's clearly not the case. You want them to go back to work and to essentially put their lives at risk, and unfortunately that's a story. And back to the idea of how we think about um, propelling their voices. I mean, unfortunately, there's no magic bullet, but what we're beginning to see is a symphony of voices begin to take place. So we saw organizations like Les Ligues des Droits Libertaires, Quebec, part of the institutional Quebec left, beginning to take up the demands of prisoners, where we've seen outbreaks now happen, and the first prisoner had died just a few days ago. We've seen them take up the demands of undocumented and non-status people, La Fédération de Femmes de Quebec. So we're beginning to see a change um, in sort of institutions within the Quebec left outside of the trade union movement. Um, and I think that's where we need to apply more pressure and to gain support, because unfortunately, many people will see this sort of, let's say, anti-racist work or challenging the discourse of CAC as sometimes unfortunately an Anglo-Franco divide, where we saw that around Bill 21. And I think what civil society and the unions need to do, and this is where uh, broadly, but more specifically around these communities as well, is that uh, the reason why CAC is doing this is no different than what's happening with Trump or Boris Johnson. What's happening is a different language or no language. And that's what's been smarter about his approach. And I think, and it plays into his worldview, it plays into their party's perception of the world around them, in terms of a ethnic nationalism, in terms of, but at the same time, placating to the demands uh, uh, of capital, and we're beginning to see that what's been smarter uh, is that there's just been no language. Once he realized that people won't accept the herd immunity conversation, they just dropped the language and they adopted this patronizing language, or that there are these two worlds. And that essentially also overtly plays into that logic. There's um, for those who have cottages, um, your world is fine and safe. Uh, and for those who work in long-term care homes, you're brown and black, um, or you're an older person relying on the state, you're at risk. So why should we keep closing society for you? And and so, but and so what we need to do at this moment, I think, is to really to challenge the government, not just around peculiarities anymore, but to not accept. And I think people are timid. Is this being cheap? Is this sort of, how can you oppose, during a time of a pandemic when there are all of these measures being done? Uh, I think actually quite the opposite. I think we need to go after the government in a more fundamental way. Um, Not because things will return back to the kind of the politics pre the crisis, the way that the crisis is developed and the pandemic's developed because of the political nature, uh, uh, not just of the pandemic, of neoliberal capitalism, of global capitalism, but of the particular way uh, uh, politics uh, here in Quebec and how that's shaping, I think, why the pandemic has spread so largely.
Right. I mean, when you're talking about the beginning of organizing that's happening amongst the racialized communities, if you think there's anything that we can do to help amplify those voices, please do get in touch. We'd really appreciate that.
Well, I think one thing that maybe that needs to begin to happen is to begin to have a conversation amongst all of these voices, and I think to really show the systemic nature, because people will say, well, maybe that's just in New York, or that's just in Michigan, or That's just in South Africa. But once you start naming and going after, or in Brazil, who's affected in Brazil or not affected in Brazil, and so once you keep going down the list, there truly is a systemic nature to it. And I think to bring all of those voices together to really demonstrate the systemic nature of it, but then also to be able to share those strategies of resistance, both within those communities, but in a broader sense as well.
Well, I look forward to you letting me know when we can convene such a meeting. I think it is an important one, and it's not just for Quebec, but everywhere. And so, but I'd like to really thank you, Mustafa. I think your insights have been really important in this discussion, and I'd really like to thank you for giving time to join us here. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much, Firoz, and it's been an honor and a pleasure, and hope to continue the conversation and also the conversations that you're having with really critical voices during this pandemic, and giving us space um, for us, despite the fact that we can't meet in person, to share those conversations and strategies amongst different organizers and activists and writers and thinkers.
Well, thank you. That's. I hope we are making a small contribution to that debate, discussion, and an alternative reassertion of the claim to be human and to
Mm.
the claim to invent our humanity. Mustafa Hanaway, thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID. I look forward to further conversations with you.
Thank you so much, Firoz, again, and I look forward to those future conversations too.
Indeed. Take care.
Take care.
This is Feroz Manji from Daraja Press, signing off for this morning. We have another discussion coming up in about an hour's time, hour and a half's time, with activists from part of the world which we don't often hear from, and these are activists from the Rust Belt of the US, in particular Rockford, Illinois. So I hope you'll join us on that. And thank you for joining us today on Organizing in the Time of COVID. Or, as I keep saying on other programs, Organizing in the Time of Chaos. This is Feroz Manji signing off.